Hello, this is a tutorial on how to make simple low polygon to medium polygon hair that's ready for games, films, or your artwork. Now, modeling hair is a difficult thing for many people, simply because it requires so much interaction between the strands. It needs to fall in a certain way, it needs to be styled, and that's pretty difficult for all but the experts to accomplish, until now at least. The method that I'm going to show you is a super quick way to model hair and to get it styled into place. Now, once you've gotten used to this process, it's totally feasible to make a really good head of hair in less than half an hour. It's true though that this style of hair modeling won't be for everybody. Everybody has their own idea of what constitutes nice looking hair. Because it depends on your needs, it depends on your purpose, and what other kind of processing you're going to do to it. In this case, this hair isn't going to require any textures whatsoever. Now, I wouldn't say that this is for a cartoony style per se, but it's definitely going to be a little stylized. Now, we're not going for realism per se. What we're going for is easily identifiable characters. And such characters are easily identifiable because of the shapes, the silhouette, the basic form of the hair. And you can see an example here with one of my characters that's going to show in my series Brute, which is premiering soon, by the way. Now, Brute isn't a game, but it's an animated show, and I'm animating it largely in the Unreal Engine, in the Unreal Development Kit to be specific, but I need my characters to be to a certain poly limitation, just like you would in a game, and that includes my hair. The great part about this hair modeling method is it's very flexible. You can accomplish either more cartoony looks or more realistic looks, depending on the poly count and other factors I'll be talking about. So let's get started and I'll show you just how this is done so fast and why it's so flexible. So for the purpose of this tutorial, I've made this quick mock-up head here. And while it's true that I've modeled it in a specific way that's conducive to what we want to accomplish in this tutorial, there are a couple of different ways that you can go about beginning with the basis for your hair. The principle that matters here is that we need a good clean basis of an area where we're going to sprout our hair from. If the head itself is modeled correctly, it should have very clean topology. If it doesn't have this, we're going to need to model a new piece over the head, and whichever way you end up doing it, you'll see how it's supposed to look as I progress. So I'm doing this tutorial in Maya, but the principles here should be able to apply to any modern 3D modeling software that has similar features. One of the important things we're going to need for this is some kind of cloth simulation. And Maya has N-cloth, and that's what we're going to use here. Even if you don't have cloth sim, you can still follow this tutorial. You won't be able to get it to quite as stylized a point, but with some manual work, you should be able to get a nice result anyway. Just some tips. In our selection settings, it'll really help the process if we turn on reflection, because what we're going to be doing first is selecting out an area where the hair is going to sprout from. Picture a guy when he has his head shaved and it's just begun to grow back out a little bit, and you can see the nice silhouette of where the hair sprouts from. That's basically the type of area that we're going to select from the head here. So we'll start by examining the topology of the head a little bit, and trying to map out where would be the best sort of border. And I think something like this would be a good starting point. We'll want to go into face selection mode, and we'll begin selecting faces around the head. And as I go along here, you can see the yellow vertices light up on the other side as well as the side that I'm selecting the faces on. And this is useful because we want to make sure that we're doing this symmetrically. We don't want one side of the head to be different than the other. We'll start just by selecting the outer border all the way around the head of where we want the hair to sprout from, and then we'll switch over to the paint selection tool to make it a little easier, not so tedious to select all the faces that we need. So if you're doing this method like I am, it's probably because you have fairly clean topology on your head. You want to have a nice even grid shape for this to really work well. And there should also be a certain flow to the mesh, where, as you can see at the back, it dips down a little bit as well as at the front. in the middle of the forehead, because this is the way that hair naturally sprouts from the head. Ideally, at this point, your mesh isn't triangulated. You have a nice straight line going from the front to the back of the head in the edge topology. This is very important for things like the parting of the hair. So if you don't have this, I'd really recommend starting with a cube, which you overlay on top of the head, and then you slowly subdivide it to the point where it's roughly the same polygon density as what we have here. And when you subdivide it, you don't want it to preserve the edges. You want it to slowly become more rounded and following the curvature of the head. And you can use different tools to help you accomplish this, like the soft selection tool. And when you're done, you should have a result very similar to what I'm going to show you in this next step. Having used the head zone topology, we now have the faces that we want selected, and we're going to go to the mesh menu and extract. Next, with our new mesh selected, we're going to want to go to the edit menu and duplicate. Then we need to resize the mesh a little bit so that it sits just over the head, kind of like a helmet would, and this is why I like to call it a hair helmet. Examine your helmet and make sure that there are no areas that stick through into the head itself, and try and make sure that areas like the corners, especially around the ears, are shaped somewhat realistically. In my example, the corner behind the ear goes down a little too far. It's supposed to kind of curve up a little bit. So I'm going to use the soft selection tool to kind of nudge it more to where it needs to be. And then areas like the bottom of the back and the middle of the front, we can nudge those up and down as well, so that they kind of form a realistic shape of where hair is supposed to sprout from. Once we're all done, the next important step is to select all the vertices of this new mesh. And the reason we're going to do this is the vertices are where our hair is going to sprout from. In Maya, this is accomplished with the extrude tool from the edit mesh menu. And the extrude tool can extrude different types of components. It can extrude faces, edges, or vertices. Neither of the first two are going to suit our purposes very well. This might differ in the software that you're using if you're using something other than Maya. But the bottom line is what we want here is to create some thick strands. If we were to simply select all the faces and extrude that, we'd end up with nothing more than a thick helmet. That's not what we want. We want strands. So we're going to select the vertices and go to the settings of the extrude tool. The settings are really the key to making it look nice and toward the level of realism that you want. So we have three different settings to work with here. We have width, length, and divisions, and all three of these are equally important. If you don't have enough divisions, your strands of hair won't flow very well. They'll end up looking very square. They'll have very defined corners, and this is just plain ugly. But by the same token, if you put too many divisions, you'll end up with hair that's so high polygon it really kind of defeats the point of making hair for a game engine. Though if you're doing this for something like film, then it's perfectly okay if it's a little higher. Now, me personally, I tend to find that the sweet spot is around 5 division levels. The length is going to definitely affect what kind of style that you're able to accomplish, so you really have to think about this carefully. Now, I'm going to show you some examples of what you can accomplish with different lengths and widths. And while I'm showing you this, keep in mind that you don't have to extrude all the vertices at once. You can select different areas. For example, if you want the area above the ears to be a little shorter, the back of the head to be a little shorter, but a longer layered fringe over top, you can certainly do this in multiple passes. A single pass is really more suitable if you want a long hairstyle, a messy hairstyle, somebody who looks a little unkempt. Now, as for the width of the strands, this is totally going to be the difference between something nice and convincing looking or something that looks more like an old man who's losing his hair. And of course, depending on the kind of character, maybe that's what you're after, but usually not. So a width setting of 0.1 will really get you that old man look. And you can see the different levels in between, how much space it adds between the different strands. 0.5 seems to be like the magic spot here, because it creates hair strands that are totally butted up together at the root, and it's kind of like they're sticking up from the head in clumps. And that's really nice. So once you're satisfied and have your settings applied, go ahead and close out of the extrude tool. Next, you're probably going to run into some issues after you've done your extrude where certain strands might stick through the ears and things like that. And that's just natural and something we can correct very easily. And to do that, we're going to use the soft selection tool again. Simply select one face or set of vertices, and using the soft select, switch to the fall off mode that says volume, and this will let you control multiple strands rather than just a single strand. And you want to lift up the area of the hair that's kind of overlapping the ears. This is important because next, when we're doing the simulation, we want the simulation to fall very nicely over the head mesh and not poke through. That would kind of ruin the simulation if we had areas that were sticking through or not sitting nicely on top of the head. And before we proceed with the simulation, we're going to do a little more pre-styling. With the soft selection tool, we can do a whole bunch of things. We can shorten or lengthen certain areas, give them a little bit more dynamic feel. I want the upper hair to be longer, and I want the sides shorter, the back shorter a little bit as well. And to do this, we're simply going to select vertices. We'll select the vertices that are the furthest from the head, and using soft select, if we make sure that we're not pulling any of the vertices that are directly over the head, then we can prevent any poke through into the head when we move the strands around. Adjusting our fall off radius so that you can see that the red area doesn't extend into the head. This will help us to prevent any issues. So we've got our hair pre-styled now, and the next thing we're going to do is where the magic pretty much really happens. We're going to be using the end cloth in Maya, or whatever program you're using, any kind of cloth simulation you have. You can follow these same steps almost to the letter. From the drop down in the top left of the Maya program, we can select End Dynamics, and this will bring us all the end cloth simulation menus at the top. We're going to be using the End Mesh menu only. So the principle here is that we need a collider mesh and an actual simulation mesh. The collider mesh is going to be the head, and the simulation mesh is going to be the hair. And the hair is going to collide against the head and drape down over top of it. Pretty much exactly the same way clothing works when you want it to flow over the body. So with your head mesh selected, go to the End Mesh menu, and then you'll find Create Passive Collider, and you can either select this directly or you can go into the settings by pressing the square icon. And what the settings really allow you to do is make sure you're matching your objects, your collider and your simulation mesh to the same simulation. Otherwise you're not going to see anything happen when you perform it. So I'll create my collider under New Solver, hit Apply, and then Close. The solver is called Nucleus 1. And next, if we're using Maya, we should have our collision settings here. Over to the right, we should have a solver display, and we would turn that on to collision thickness. And this will change the display color of our mesh to yellow. We also don't want the thickness of the mesh to be very thick at all, so we can turn that setting way down. Otherwise, what will happen when we do the cloth solve, the head will pretty much be like a shell. It'll be much thicker and the hair will be poking through it. That'll create the same problem that I was talking to you about earlier. But if there's no thickness to the collider at all, then there's nothing for the hair to collide against and the simulation won't work. So make the thickness setting very, very thin so that the size of the head doesn't noticeably increase. We're probably going to notice some spots where the hair is sticking through anyway. And with the soft selection tool, we can go ahead and fix these. We can also resize the whole hair mesh a little bit. And once it's to the point where we no longer see any yellow poking through, we can go ahead and convert the hair mesh into cloth. This is done from the same End Mesh menu at the top, Create Cloth, go to the settings, make sure the solver is Nucleus 1, the same solver as the collider. Then hit Apply. Make sure that your hair cloth mesh is selected, then go down to the bottom where we see the timeline. The timeline is where we're going to control the simulation. Pressing the play button begins the simulation, but we're going to want to make some slight changes. In the timeline, depending on what you're simulating, depending on the complexity of the mesh, you might want to have more or less frames on your timeline. If you have a very dense mesh, you're going to want to add some length, some new frames to your timeline. In our case, we have a relatively light mesh. I think 100 frames should work just fine. We probably won't even need that much. But it's always better to have a little extra to work with. In the attribute editor, you should now be seeing some new fields like wind field generation, force field generation, dynamic properties, and all these are going to come into play in order to help us do a convincing simulation of the style of hair that we want. Now by default we could go ahead and just hit simulate by pressing play, but we would find that the hair settles into a position that's probably not exactly what we're after. So these different fields here are going to help us adjust the way the hair falls. When you do a cloth solve, it doesn't really matter how many frames you play or how many times you do the simulation. You can always go back to the beginning, start over again, try stopping at different points in the timeline and seeing where you're at. See what frame provides the closest kind of result to the kind of hairstyle that you want. And of course, like I said, you're probably not going to accomplish the style that you want without adjusting some of those settings. So go back to the beginning, tweak a setting, and then hit play again until you find what you're after. You also have different presets to work with different kind of stretchiness, different kind of materials. There's ones for like denim, cotton, even chainmail or honey, things like that. But in my experience, using these presets isn't a very good idea. If for no other reason than for the fact that it really slows things down to an extreme level. For some reason the default settings are much more optimized. And even if you tweak the settings in the dynamic properties and the wind field generation, it doesn't slow anything down significantly, but the presets all do. So let's go ahead and see what the default simulation looks like. When I perform it, as it settles into place, you can see that it's nice, but it's a little lifeless. The hair strands have no randomization or anything like that, so it feels a little boring. And right now this guy looks to me like some kind of diehard Brit rocker or something. So let's see if we can't do a little better. And to do this, we'll go directly into the dynamic properties. We'll scroll down to the wind field settings, local force, local wind, and the other stuff above, especially like resistance, stretch resistance and things like that. Those can have a huge effect, but we're going to ignore those for now. We're only going to adjust the local force and local wind, and if you go down into one of the lower drop downs, force field generation and wind field generation, we're going to adjust those as well. Experiment with different forces. Our front to back axis here is the z-axis, so we're going to want to adjust the force and the wind levels in that axis. Especially because what happens when we do our default simulation, if we let that run more to the end, we can see that our character's hair starts slipping backwards off the head, and we don't want that. He starts looking like even more of a diehard rocker, like he's balding and stuff. If we were to push the wind and the force too much in the other direction though, he'd end up looking kind of like this. Kind of a Justin Bieber look there. Not my thing. So we want to find some middle ground, and I think that's when we'll accomplish a nice decent look here. And when you see the final hairstyle, you might think, oh man, that's seriously ugly. And it's your right to think so. I mean, everybody has their own look, and remember this is all about finding a certain kind of character. And you can use this technique to accomplish any kind of character look that you want. Just because you use this technique doesn't mean your hair will end up looking like my character. Of course, if you follow this tutorial to the letter, then yeah, sure it will, but use your imagination and I'm sure you can accomplish any kind of look you desire within the realm of this overall aesthetic. So here's our character with hair fully simulated, and after we've done the simulation, we can go ahead and export that out and then import it back in as an OBJ. And then do things like color it, style it some more with the soft selection tools or whatever you want. So that's pretty much all there is to it, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and found it'll help you in your own workflow. If you want to see this workflow in action in a finished product, beside the example that I showed you, it's going to be in my animation, Brute. And again, that's due out soon. You can find it here on my Voxhouse YouTube channel or at bruteseries.com. So stay tuned for that, and thanks a lot for watching.